Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started today, I just want to remind you that one of the ways we keep the lights on around here is subscriptions to Blaze TV. So if you want to support what I'm doing on the show and you want to enjoy all the other fantastic behind the scenes content from your favorite Blaze TV hosts, you need to head to blazetv.com/Auron and use the promo code Auron to get $20 off your subscription today. That's blazetv.com/Auron to get $20 off today. Well, guys, I have really been enjoying the Night of the Seven Kingdoms show that has come on HBO. It's a sequel to, well, not a sequel, but it's in the universe of Game of Thrones. It has really changed, I think, what a lot of people were feeling was a bad direction for the series. It was getting too dark, too dire, too complex, and hard to follow. And we saw a show that came out that really showed a lot of heart. And really that word of mouth is the only reason I ended up going back to Game of Thrones, because so many people who I thought had checked out said, no, really, you got to give this one a chance. So I want to talk about what made this show different and why it might help to revive the Game of Thrones franchise. Joining me to do that today is a filthy Game of Thrones casual, Jack Posobiec. Thank you so much for coming on.
Wow. using my own phrase for the filthy casual show only book burner fans who refuse to read any of the Game of Thrones novels, let alone novellas like Night of the Seven Kingdoms. My goodness.
Well, I didn't know when I met you that you had this whole background in the Game of Thrones universe. Like I like the shows. I watched the first season of the show. And then I was like, okay, I got to know what happens. There's no way I'm waiting for all of this show to happen. So I went back and read all of the books that were available at the time. I think it was all but the last like two were available at that time. And so I've read the mainline books. And I think I even have like, there's kind of like a Silmarillion for Game of Thrones where like Martin worked with some
There's
other
like
people.
two of those now.
Background. Okay. I read one of those, but I never read the small novel that this was based on. But before we dive into the show and all of that background, why don't you tell people your history with Game of Thrones?
Yeah, so people, obviously people know me more for like politics and Trump stuff and all that. But prior to my political whatever media work and activism and Turning Point and everything else, I was online and ran a blog and my original Twitter account was called, I was the Angry GOT fan. And as Angry GOT fan, it started off when I was still in the military, still in the intel community, and was posting anonymously. So, former Anon here, recovering Anon, and was always tweeting from the perspective of a guy who was a book fan who was not a fan of the show. And it was done as a character. It was very funny. And, we tried to, it's kind of like Red Letter Media, if anyone knows that, or like Mr. Plinkett. Mm-hmm. And I was always doing it as this character, but as the show got further and further away from the books, the character, and we did this for years, the blog and the Twitter account really took off, and we were getting over 100,000 views at one point on the blog itself. It was just angrygotfan.com. We did a lot of humor on there. We wrote a Trump and Sansa fanfic at one point because when Trump was running for president, the goal was, of course, that he needed to unite the Northern Lords, and so, of course, asking for Sansa's hand in marriage was clearly the way to be able to do this. The left tries to bring this up every once in a while, like it's some kind of attack on me. I'm like, you guys are just so boring and stupid. And it's like one of the only things that I've ever left still public from that blog because it's just so hilarious. And so, yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I actually got to, get into it with some of those guys that worked on those Silmarillion type, type books with, it's called Elio and Linda. Some of the people who ran Westeros.org and ran some and actually wrote some books and have been assistants of George R. R. Martin. I got to meet with George R. R. Martin a number of times during this time frame. And then, I decided that since the book stopped coming out in 2016, I'd step away for a brief period to make America great again. So here we are.
So you left a promising career in, a media criticism and instead transitioned to hanging out at the White House and being highly influential in politics.
Yeah, there's actually a Vice profile of me from like 2017 that where a guy, and I've had a number of journalists like reach out to me and say, "Hey, man, just so you know, like I used to follow Angry GOT Fan, like I really liked it," and they kind of have to like sheepishly admit that they actually thought it was hilarious. And I have this Vice article on me that, it takes the normal sort of like, the litany of horribles on me, but also kind of points out that, hey, here's this Game of Thrones blogger and now he's in the White House. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic backstory. I really enjoy that. And we're going to dive, of course, into the show itself. But before we do, guys, let me tell you a little bit about Frontier Magazine. Hey, guys, we all have to read things digitally these days, but I'm old school. Whenever I can, I want to feel the weight of the page in my hand. So when I look at Frontier Magazine, which is always beautifully shot and beautifully laid out and has really interesting articles, that's what I'm looking for. I've written for Frontier. Many of my guests have written for Frontier from this show. And if you want to get access to Frontier Magazine, you need to subscribe to Blaze Unlimited. When you do, you're not just going to get issue 5, you're also going to get all the other premium perks, and you're going to get back issues 1 through 4 digitally, so you're immediately caught up. If you want to do that, you need to head to blazeunlimited.com/Auron and use the promo code Frontier40 to get $40 off your subscription. That's blazeunlimited.com/Auron, Frontier40 for that discount. All right, so like I said, have read the books, but it's been a while. I certainly was not running a blog or anything, so I have no doubt that you are far more familiar with the ins and outs and where the show differentiates from the books. This is the problem over time. Of course, I read all the Lord of the Rings books several times, but at this point, I've seen the movies so often, it can be hard to remember and separate exactly which events exist in each one. But you're saying that from the very beginning, you were not a fan of the show. You found that from the beginning, the show had moved too far away from what Martin had laid out in the books.
Well, yeah, and that by that I mean the original 2011 Game of Thrones show, not Night of the Seven Kingdoms. So,
right.
Just right off the bat, you could tell. I mean, season 1, to be fair, season 1 is the closest to the books that we've seen, thus far. But right off the bat, there were already, changes being made. There was, we didn't have the word woke yet. That had yet to enter the lexicon. But you would, so we used to say social justice warrior, and we used to say things like this. And so I was never part of Gamergate or anything like that. But, this was sort of my entree to this whole world was through criticizing what I saw was the rise of social justice or wokeness in HBO. And then, of course, in the fan space, you would get these sort of wars that were going on between people who were supporters of the books and supporters of the show, which kind of mirrored a lot of the same parallels that people saw in Gamergate, which is going on pretty much right at this time frame. And so there was some overlap with that, with guys like Vox Day, who were running the Rabid Puppies, which was a direct attack on George R. R. Martin over the Hugo Awards. We're getting like way in the weeds here, but
I know this lore, but yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, this is like the deep lore. But what's really funny though is when I started tweeting about Night of the Seven Kingdoms, there were people from the Game of Thrones community, which is funny because I've been out of it for so long that there were people on like TikTok and there were, Instagram type people who were responding saying, "Oh, Posobiec's trying to get into Game of Thrones. Like he's some tourist. He's a political commentator, a political creator. He has no idea." And I'm like, you have no idea. You have no clue. Do not cite the deep magic to me, witch.
Yeah, you were there when it was written. Yeah, no. Obviously you were vindicated, I think, by the end of the show. A lot of people saw the momentum falling off. I think you can say through the first 3 seasons, even if you have difficulty with some of the changes, you at least have solid television for people who are probably unfamiliar with the books. But it becomes very clear as you move on that storylines start coming apart. And famously, Martin has not finished the series. Many are speculating he may never finish the series. And so how much of this do you think came from showrunners interfering with this or not understanding the material, trying to inject that social justice, as it was called at the time? And how much of that was at the core of kind of where Martin was going? Do you think he really had a true roadmap? Do you think his kind of the creativity for him petered out, or do you think that really was mainly showrunners and a lack of understanding the material from the network?
No, I think a lot of it was actually HBO. I'm kind of a George R. R. Martin defender in terms of this, because I have this really weird take where I actually support the ending of Daenerys being this evil figure. And throughout the course of when I ran the blog, I was always arguing against the social justice warriors because of this, because of course, ultimately they were always supporting the character of Daenerys, and that she could do no wrong, that everything she did was perfectly awesome because Yas Queen. And we remember there was this whole social phenomenon where people were naming their daughter Khaleesi, people were naming their family members, after her. This was a huge, huge point and in our society for like almost a decade. And suddenly all of that went off the rails because she obviously turned into an evil dragon queen. And had been arguing all along that if you just read the novels, you can see this madness. And there's a line in the novels where George R. R. Martin says over and over that every time a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin, and one side is greatness and one side is madness. She is, of course, the daughter of Mad King Aerys. She is someone who is seen as potentially this naive princess at the beginning, but as she gains power, she conducts actions which are, to my mind, are clearly very self-serving, very selfish, and ultimately evil. And you see this narcissistic rage come up again and again. Whereas on the TV show, she's presented, and we all remember this famous picture, right, of where she's the liberator of the slaves, and they're all sort of like parading upon her, and it became this meme of like, white women when they tip extra at Starbucks or whatever, and it became this total meme of it. And in the books, there's an element of that, but it's not played up as much as in the TV show. Also, she's victimized in the TV show much more. She's portrayed in the very first episode, for example, she is portrayed as a rape victim. And in that scene, for example, it's the wedding night where she marries Khal Drogo. That scene in the books is completely different, where Drogo actually asks her consent. He asks her if she feels okay with it. She says yes. So it's completely changed even from that very original scene. And remember, if you go back, this was 2011, this was sort of the time of like the UVA. We were told that campuses were, these rape factories, that every guy on campus was just about to date rape you. And there was this huge hysteria over this on campus. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it like it is, that's what it was. And I think that bled over into HBO, and it continued to bleed over in that character, whereby in the show, you just don't have, or excuse me, in the books, you don't have that sort of portrayal of Daenerys. It's much more shown on her own volition that she's doing these things, up to and including, by the way, having her husband kill her own brother so that she becomes the heir to the throne, at least for the Targaryens. And this is something where I would constantly be battling these woke Daenerys fans, saying, guys, she's kind of evil, And so anyway, long story, not to rehash all of that, but to point out that they just totally mismanaged and mistold the story, where instead of portraying it that way, they turned everyone into these sort of caricatures, where a nuanced character like Daenerys or a nuanced character like Stannis just became a one-dimensional or maybe two-dimensional character seeking power or always seeking liberation, and then flips on a dime. And so by the end of season 8, everyone's got their hopes in her, and it's a total rug pull because the writers, of course, didn't actually know what they were doing. And that's why David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, who were the writers of the TV show, have, if you notice, by the way, been pretty much excommunicated from Hollywood since then. At one point, they were going to be given a new Star Wars trilogy. That has totally not come to fruition. In fact, Star Wars, another series where, I've seen examples of this, like Kathleen Kennedy, have gone down the same path, where they haven't had any movies since, I think it was the oh my gosh, was it The Rise of the Skywalker or whatever the last
Right.
Disney movie was? And I guess they're doing like a Mandalorian and Baby Yoda movie, which is just super weird right now. It's just based on the TV show. But those writers have been completely kicked out of Hollywood pretty much ever since.
Yeah, when you train wreck what is probably the last like collectively enjoyed cultural property of that era, that badly, I think that's pretty huge. I mean, basically, I don't think until Stranger Things you had a show that was so simultaneously watched again by the United States. Really became water cooler talk, but even more
No, but Stranger
disastrous.
Things again, by the way, another
Yes,
issue
yeah,
with finale.
yes. Very, very true. Well, actually, I didn't even see the last season because it was already going off the rails at that point. But I heard
No,
it was
I
quite
watched
bad.
it, and I was out in front saying that guys, they're doing everything wrong here, and again, the injection of wokeness.
Yeah. Well, an even more impressive failure, I think, is the House of the Dragon show.
Ugh.
It's one that competently acted, I guess. Nice sets and things, but ultimately it just seemed to go nowhere. I turned it off halfway through the first season because I was just bored and depressed. There was just it felt like they took all the wrong lessons from what people wanted from Game of Thrones and threw it into a new series. It just seemed entirely aimless, and it's working completely without any original book material. Right? That one's just completely written
Well, so
by
that one's
the studio.
got they're sort of this is in that similarian vein where George R. Martin has put out what he calls these fake histories of Westeros.
Mm.
And so there are some sort of like bullet point Wikipedia article type fake histories that you can books that you can get on this period and the Dance of the Dragons, and it's this Targaryen civil war. It's the war that ends the dragons, the line of the dragons in Westeros. So it's why there's no dragons at the time of Night of the Seven Kingdoms, or certainly by the time of Song of Ice and Fire, which is the main series. And so it supposedly is this really cool civil war with like dragons fighting dragons in the sky, but instead you don't get any of that. And also, of course, you have the very strange and I think everyone's just pointed out it's kind of silly addition of a totally race swapped version of the House Valerian, which are again so the Targaryens and Valerians are supposed to be based on like the Romans and like the Roman Empire, and by the way, the concept of race comes up very importantly in Game of Thrones from a plot perspective, because remember, this is sort of the world before DNA, the world before CSI analysis. So if you're trying to figure out who is the son, who is the heir to the throne, you're looking at things like skin color, eye color, hair color. This becomes a huge plot point with the son of Robert Baratheon in the first season not actually being his son, and therefore not actually being the heir to the throne. Spoiler alert, which is why which is what leads Ned Stark and others to their death in the very first season, to protect this secret that Joffrey was not actually the son of the king, and neither were his brother and sister. And so the fact that you would add in this sort of like race swapped version of these Targaryen similar family from old Valeria is just ridiculous, and just obviously ridiculous on its face.
Jack, are you telling me that a show based on monarchy and succession and heritage and all these things, it matters that, that's actually how genetics works? It's actually how lines of descent work. And a very interesting thing about Game of Thrones that's important too is, obviously this is a show that is trying to mimic in some way European history. It's echoing different parts of that. But also, when the show was originally kind of trying to tell its story, the racial change was kind of like geography. We knew we were in different places because the people looked different. It was a visual cue as to the different cultures and lands and peoples we were encountering. The show was diverse, I guess, in that sense. But there was a particular logic to where people, people from the South had darker skin, people from the North had lighter skin. Like you knew it was the natural understanding of how you would get a distribution of melanin in any given geographic setting. And so it helped us understand the world. But when you get this like weird swapping in, and the people that obviously did not belong in that particular setting introduced without any kind of connection to the world, it's jarring. It breaks up the visual language of the show and makes it very confusing for people to follow.
Well, yeah, and one of the examples of this, so if to jump ahead to Night of Seven Kingdoms a little bit, when there's the character with, and by the way, are we going spoilers free? Because this is a spoiler.
All right, yeah. So we should make it should stop here and make it clear, guys. We are going to be discussing the show in depth. So if you are worried, you haven't seen it yet, it only takes literally, I think it's like 3 hours total to watch because the episodes are so short. So if you need to fix that, stop, go do that, come back, because we are going to actually get into plot points here. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so big part of this. Why is the kid bald? Right, you see it from the posters and all the images of it. Why is the kid bald? Why is he like that? Well, the reason that he's bald is because he has the traditional Targaryen silver hair, and that he is trying to hide the fact that he is a Targaryen by covering up the fact that he has this it's sort of like this bleach blonde hair that you see most of the Targaryens have. And this is something, of course, that the sort of woke HBO fans were getting mad at me about, because I was pointing out that the Targaryens are white, and therefore anything the Targaryens do is white culture. It's obviously based on white culture. They were trying to say, oh no, they have a Dornish influence. And I'm like, well, this kid's clearly not Dornish. So again, it's a huge plot point because he's trying to be in incognito and go throughout the Seven Kingdoms as a squire for this hedge knight. And spoiler alert, or not spoiler alert, but just personal note that Night of the Seven Kingdoms, the Tales of Dunk and Egg, have always been just a personal favorite of mine. I love this series because it's a smaller story, because it's much narrower, and we can obviously talk about that. But yes, this is a huge plot point in the series itself that we're talking about, is basic genetics and coloring and all of this. It's the reason that he's bald.
So let's get into the show itself, since we've talked about all the previous iterations and why this one is different. So you point out that this starts from source material that is shorter. It's more of a novella. It's more concise. The show itself is only about, I think the first episode's something like 45 minutes, and all the rest of them are closer to like 30 minutes, which is something we haven't seen from HBO in a long time. It's all about these big epic shows. And of course, Game of Thrones is one of the shows that started that or made that such a desirable thing. But I think the fact that this is really shrunk down gives us a much better understanding of the world and makes it far more cohesive. One of the problems with Game of Thrones, especially as it got looser later on with the writing, was it was clear they didn't know what to do with all the characters and trying to switch perspectives and follow things around, all the scales of epic battles and these kind of things. This feels like a lot happens, but it all happens really over a few days in a particular area. There's only a maximum of 14 guys fighting at the end of the show. So this is really something where we went from these pitched giant dragon battles of, hundreds of thousands of people clashing over massive battlefields and cities. And all of a sudden, actually, now we're just having a story about a normal guy going to a tournament and trying to figure out how he's going to fight. But radically different scope. And I think that really helps out a lot.
No, it's amazing. It winds it down. So the original, because a lot of people don't know this, the original Song of Ice and Fire, so the main series, is based on the historical period of the War of the Roses, which was a British Civil War. And for anyone who thinks that George R. R. Martin is some creative genius, the War of the Roses was the Yorks versus the Lancasters, as in the Starks and the Lannisters. You see, and instead of Eddard, they had Edward, and there's just so many different things you could point out where it's actually much more similar than than people realize. Oh, Yorks and Lancasters, Starks and Lannisters. Okay, got it. So once you realize what he's doing there, you realize that, oh, okay, he's just taking some of that and even simplifying it, but at the same time, it's still quite complex in terms of the books. And he's adding great characters, and I'm someone who, a lot of people detract from George R. R. Martin. A lot of people have said, and I think wrongly, have given him this criticism that he doesn't believe in heroism, that he's nihilistic, and you just don't see that from this series at all. You do see heroism in the character of Duncan the Tall, Sir Duncan the Tall, that he is this, there's a great line in the books that they haven't used in the show yet, where they say, "Dunk the lunk, thick as a castle wall," and he's not necessarily seen as the smartest knight of the Seven Kingdoms. He's not seen as this, genius. He certainly doesn't understand any of these affairs of state or the palace intrigues, which of course is played up to great comedic effect in the series, both on the page and the screen. And of course his young squire, who actually is a member of the royal family, is constantly having to explain to him like what he's done wrong and who he's offended. And of course this all it all eventually culminates in him having to go on this huge trial because he is defending a girl's honor, a puppeteer's honor, or puppetress, I suppose you could say. And the person that he strikes is one of the princes of the royal family. And so it does get into these ideas of class. It gets into ideas of, can you become something greater? He's from a very impoverished background. He grew up in Flea Bottom, which is known as the sort of like the slums of it's like the Harlem, I guess, of King's Landing, or the Hell's Kitchen of King's Landing, if you will. And he's a squire who's come up, and of course there is the I don't know if I guess I'll just say it because we are doing spoilers here. That
we've already made it clear.
Yeah, we made it clear. So one of the big questions over all of this is, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts, that was he actually knighted? And there's sort of this big mystery as to whether or not Sir Arlen ever actually bestowed on him knighthood, or if he died beforehand. So is Dunk actually lying about being knighted when he's trying to prove himself? And this of course plays into, I think, the wider series as well, which by the way in the books is never confirmed one way or the other.
Yeah, I haven't read the books yet, though. I have that queued up for myself. But from at least in the show, it's heavily hinted that he was never knighted. It's very clear that he's having that conversation while his lord is dying, and he's asking, "Why didn't you ever make me a knight?" And it seemed like he kind of dies on the tree there before doing it. He's hesitant to knight others during the battle, but right before the trial of the Seven.
Yeah, a lot of that is added. It's hinted at in the novellas, but it's on the screen. I think they made it much more explicit.
Gotcha. So that may or may not continue to play in, but I think at least in the show canon, it seems like they're going for he never really was knighted, which makes it interesting because then there's that tension. He believes so fervently and so sincerely in the knight's code, except for the one thing where he wasn't a knight, and that's kind of obviously a tension there that I'm sure will probably play itself out in later seasons, because it does look like we are going to get later seasons, and we'll certainly talk about that before we're done here. But I want to just go back and touch on a few of the things that you said there at the beginning. First, it's so refreshing to see a true hero's journey, because we were kind of prefigured. We know Duncan the Tall ends up doing great things. We have that knowledge because of previous shows. So we know he's got a larger arc, a longer story, but we also know that he's coming from nothing. He's he's kind of dumb, he's poor, he's from the slums. And so we know we were going to go on this journey. We just don't know how we're going to get there, but it's refreshing to have a classic hero's journey. It's also really refreshing that, as you say, we've seen heroism before. We've seen the Starks and others be heroic, but Dunk's allowed to be heroic and have some fun about it. There's actual comedy in the show. There are moments of lightheartedness. It's not in the other series. Anytime someone does something good, not only are they immediately punished, but they're just miserable the whole time. There's never a smile on any of their faces. In this show, I feel like we are actually allowed to breathe for a minute. It's not this constant miasma of negativity that's occurring there. And so I think just that combination of getting a truly heroic character on a classic hero's journey who's allowed to have some fun, even though we're getting really brutal Game of Thrones moments and turns and things as well. I think mixing that in really ironically subverted the expectation of Game of Thrones fans, who are used to having their expectations subverted by the negativity. Instead, flip the other direction, really change the energy of the series.
Yeah, it's just an optimistic show, and take the all the race stuff or whatever, the woke stuff out of it. When's the last time you turned on the TV and actually saw something optimistic and saw something which actually gave you hope for the world, hope for yourself, hope for bettering your situation? I've actually said for years, and it was kind of cool because I had an opportunity to do something about this. I've said for years that if you go back to the 1990s, this is actually, kind of the material that George R. R. Martin was writing right after the first book came out. So if you look at it in terms of the release publishing dates, the first book, A Game of Thrones, comes out in, I think, 96, and then this comes out the very next year. And so this comes out even before the sequel, Clash of Kings, comes out. And so it's written around that same time frame. It's written in the 1990s. One of the biggest shows every Friday night in the 1990s was Hercules, The Legendary Journeys of Hercules. Mm-hmm. And this is a very similar setup where it just seems like it's the episode of the week. It's Dunk is getting into some hijinks, some issue that he's got to deal with, and he's got his sidekick there, and they're just traveling around the kingdoms and getting into nonsense. And this idea of a knight errant, if you go back to the Penny Dreadfuls of, the British Empire or the Victorian age, these were huge in British culture, these types of novels. And they're one of the things that actually led to sort of the idea of the American cowboy and a lot of the same stories that you would see there, where it's just sort of the lone ranger going out and saving, the town kind of stories. And this is what really where it came from. And it's something where I've always thought that George R. R. Martin was kind of just going for that. Like, let's just have a fun adventure series. And in fact, definite spoilers now, but the very next novella in the series is just that. It's not even, it doesn't even get into very much the high politics of the realm, which certainly the Hedge Knight does a little bit, at least in terms of the line of succession having a direct effect from the events of the story. This one is just two lords arguing over a waterway, and someone's put up a dam, and hey, you're diverting the water from my crops, and the other one's arguing and says, well, I have a claim to it and you don't. And that's the whole story. That's literally the whole story is just an argument between the two lords, which is, it's actually my favorite one because it's such a small story. And you get into more of the character-based drama rather than this high political-based drama.
That was going to be my next question for you, because this is my greatest concern. I really enjoyed the show. I just watched it a second time, to prepare for this. And again, guys, it's only like 30 minutes an episode, so you can only 6 episodes, so you can easily watch it for yourselves. But it's one of those scenarios I think of The Mandalorian, where obviously Star Wars was flailing. They were flagging. They couldn't figure out what to do with the series. They'd have a number of very prominent embarrassments, and then they kind of came out with this small little tale of just two people doing their own thing. It's much more contained and a little, grounded wouldn't be the word there, but a little more able to be followed. You didn't have the grand politics of the entire galaxy. And then after that first season, they just tried to stuff as many references and expand the scope as fast as possible. And all of a sudden, the charm of that relationship was gone, right? Like all of a sudden, that back and forth that really the show was built on fell away. And so my concern is that happens here, right? That all of a sudden, they kept most of the woke stuff out of this one. They kept the show focused and small, but the temptation is to immediately, blow it up, bring new characters in, bring in all the member berries. Hey, I remember that guy. I remember that reference. I wanted to see what's happening with these other parts. And so my big concern is that they, bring in a bunch of diversity, bring in a bunch of expanded world and plot that wasn't in those novellas. Do you think they'll be wise enough to hold to that smaller story? Do you think they have the level of restraint necessary when they have a hit like that to kind of stay focused there? Do you have faith in HBO to pull this off?
Do I have faith in HBO? No. I'm certainly glad, by the way, though, that HBO was not purchased by Netflix. So I would say that that is a point in the right direction, because this was something that certainly it seemed like it was about to happen just up until really a couple of weeks ago. This is one of the big worries I've had. And by the way, part of my I've joked that, like, because people were saying that, oh, well, it's only because Donald Trump was president that Netflix wasn't able to buy HBO, and now the Ellison family has purchased it. And it's like, don't you understand? I've been playing the long game all all along. This is angry GOT fans' revenge on you.
I would, yes, I really do want to have the storyline where you, for like the last 10 years, became a political operative just so you could control who would end up owning your favorite book franchise. That would be fantastic.
Obviously.
Right.
And that being said, I have put in a couple of requests for potential other adaptations that might be going on in the Song of Ice and Fire prequels. For example, Aegon's Conquest apparently is getting a movie series, which I certainly want to say in, if at all possible. But no, the guy who is the showrunner for, I'll put it this way. What I do have faith in is the fact that Ira Parker, the guy who is adapting this series, when you see the interviews that he's done, and when you see just watching the show itself, you can tell that this is a guy who has a serious amount of love and respect for the series and for the characters. And a lot of people were saying, oh, I think that the pacing of Dunk and Egg was very slow. It was very plodding. They were saying that, how come nothing's going on? Where's the big fight? Where's the big blow up scene? Where's the big twist? And especially even in the very final episode, there isn't any twist. It's just a slow burn type of episode. Mm-hmm. And I've said, I think that's just someone who's actually has a real deal of reverence for the series, doesn't want to change anything that he doesn't have to, and wants to put out a product that is going to stand the test of time, which, by the way, the original series has not. You don't see people holding these big Game of Thrones conventions. You don't see this fandom existing anywhere outside of a very, slim minority of people. It's nowhere near what it once was in terms of a cultural force until Night of the Seven Kingdoms came back around. And so will this inject, it's clearly injecting more popularity into the series, into the fandom. It's bringing people back in. As you mentioned, the word of mouth was very, very strong with it. And it's been something where people have come back to it and saying, you know what, this is why I liked the show in the first place. This is what I liked about the era, the adaptations, what it made it good. And so, and hopefully, I'm optimistic. I'll just say I'm optimistic. I want to see what they've done next. The casting has come out for season 2 so far, and so I haven't seen anything that really rubs me the wrong way in terms of that casting. Now, again, you never know. They did mention that they're going to be going to Dorne, which the Southern Land, as you mentioned before, which they don't do in book 2 or novella 2 of the series. So interested to kind of see what goes on there, if they're going to be adding to the plot at all in terms of any of this. But we will see. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I just hope that when they look at the ratings in terms of this, became the number 1 show on TV when it was out. It's rated the highest of any Game of Thrones episode on the IMDb charts, where it's rated higher than any of the original series or House of the Dragon, that HBO takes a look and says, hey, wait a minute, guys, we've got a real hit. This new ownership with the Ellison family, David Ellison, is going to say, guys, if it ain't broke, we don't need to fix it. Just leave it the way it is and let them cook.
Your point about the staying power, I think, is really important, because, like we were saying, this was such a cultural phenomenon. This is one of the last true shows that everyone watched, everyone was talking about. Rarely do you see something like that just immediately fade away. But when you look at Star Trek or the Stargate or any of these other like old sci-fi or fantasy shows, they tend to have big followings. People continue to do conventions. They watch them all the time. They watch them in the background, like just casually as just a way to spend time. I don't think anyone does that with Game of Thrones. I tried to rewatch some of the original series, and I think I made it through season 1 or 2, and then I just wasn't interested anymore. So I think you're right that the fact that Night of the Seven Kingdoms has just revivified interest entirely in this is critical. And you hope that they recognize the wins that they have there, that ultimately this is the formula, this is what people want. We don't need to take it somewhere else. We don't need to make it big. We don't need to, radically invest it with any kind of message. We can just let it unfold in the way that is going, and people are going to enjoy it. We can kind of trust our audience enough to continue to follow this line, and we don't have to suddenly throw a bunch of dragons or nudity or whatever in there just to keep people interested. And the show did have some crass moments. I think, actually, funny enough, that was probably the knock I heard from it the most, was how out of place those things felt and how unnecessary they were. And that's another good sign, because the show, I think, was good at moments, but it became increasingly more and more people talking about the sex scenes and the CGI dragons, and less about the acting or the character moments. And I really, it's funny you said that people push back against the pacing of this series, because I thought that was the best part about it. You get this slow buildup of these character moments, introduced to everybody, these conversations. There's not a ton of action, and then you just get this magnificent battle scene, which again is small but so powerful, and it's just been memed all over the place. I'm sure you've seen the edits, the get up edits, and everything that have happened out of that. And just just really only one episode of contained high intensity action, even then not at that big of a scope. And then it's so powerful that then you just kind of need the episode to breathe at the end. You need that slow burn, because you're just so on edge from everything that just happened, all the drama and everything. And that's kind of, I think, the beauty of a show. That's how you know a show is well done, when you appreciate those quieter moments, when you appreciate those moments to pause and think about what's happened and reflect and recover. Because instead of just, hitting you with spectacle constantly, you're actually enjoying the emotional arcs of people. You're given time to feel how the characters feel and be glad that they've made it to the other side of this. And even in the one truly big battle scene, that action was so tight for kind of what it was. I think people are appreciating that rather than using that as some kind of knock against it in general.
Exactly. And at the same time, the stakes are higher because you're more invested in the characters. You
Right.
actually don't know what's going to happen, especially because, hey, this is a Game of Thrones series after all. The protagonist could be killed. Now, of course, we know because the fact that it's a prequel, we do know that he eventually goes on and he becomes the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, so eventually does become knighted in his own right. We don't quite know the path to that yet, but there are some references to him in the main series, both in the books and in the TV show, where it comes up that he does go on to become this great knight and this great hero. And so we don't know exactly the path that is taken. And yes, we also do find out that his squire Egg becomes Aegon V, Aegon the Unlikely, the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. So even though he's the fourth son of Prince Maekar, he does eventually become the king himself in his own right. And actually, so for folks to understand the time frame, if you remember Maester Aemon, who is the maester, the old maester at the Wall when Jon Snow is there, and at Castle Black, that is the brother of Egg. So the older brother, he's the third of the four sons, and so he is someone who actually mentions Egg. Egg, I dreamt I was old, and that's the Egg that he's referring to. So if you do go back and forth, there are these references. Sir Duncan the Tall, Joffrey talks about him a couple of times. Why are there 4 pages to Sir Duncan the Tall and only one for Beric Dondarrion or whatever it was, or Barristan Selmy, and so these are ways that you get invested in the stakes, but at the same time, we don't actually know what's going to happen in those scenes. They're so well done. It's been a long time since we've seen this slow kind of burn in one of these series, and it gives you the ability, I think, to just become more familiar with the characters, to build that relationship. And if you don't feel the camaraderie, what's great about the show, and I saw somebody mention this as well, what's so great about the show is that the best parts of it, some of the best parts outside of the action, are just the moments where it's Dunk and Egg sort of hanging out. And they could be just whittling together, or he's sort of teaching him sewing and weaving in this one scene. And it's just a cool scene of a couple of dudes, as they say, just dudes being bros. And there's something just truly amazing about that we have not seen on screen in a decade, at least a decade plus.
And I think that, again, is so important for them to keep things small because, as you say, that relationship is what matters. That's the core of the show. That's really the cornerstone. And so if you start trying to bring in a bunch of plot lines and new characters and expand the scope and everything, you're just necessarily going to lose some of that. And while there's 1,000 deaths to the Game of Thrones that are shocking and everything, really after the Red Wedding, most people start to lose any kind of sense of who's important and why deaths matter. Yeah, another guy got stabbed, but I don't know. I think I spent 20 minutes with that character the entire time, so I don't really care. But obviously, as you say, in this instance, because we have focused so much on this relationship and the small circle around there, every single death, every single possible event matters because we're just so familiar with these. And I think it would be foolish for them to walk away from that relationship. I think it's critical, especially because we've seen how horrible all of the royalty in Game of Thrones can be. And that's kind of the last episode there is, Duncan saying, look, I can't even deal with princes. I don't even want to be a part of this anymore. But then he realizes he's going to be leaving Egg to his fate. He's going to be leaving him amongst all these jackals, and he's going to more likely come up, and maybe the best thing he can do, maybe the most important thing he can do for the realm is not to go and become this knight and fight alongside the Targaryens and everything else. Maybe the most important thing he can do is give this possible future prince a future, a moment, a childhood in which he is not surrounded by the most evil, devious people in the world. And maybe by going through that process, he can save him the fate of some of these other nobles. And I think that's an excellent way to end it. I don't know exactly how the first book ended. I know some people said that maybe I don't know if this is true in the novella, that the Egg doesn't sneak away, that they know he's going with Duncan. And so that's a change. And so I don't know if they're going to make that an antagonistic thing, but otherwise, I
certainly
think it's
hope not, because if they do, the new Hand of the King, Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, who also becomes a great character in the main series. He's particularly known for someone who operates a network of spies and a network of informants all throughout the land, and is dealing with this, what's called the Blackfire Rebellion, these Targaryen pretenders and the great bastards of House Targaryen. And so if they do end up making this a thing where, Dunk is kind of on the run, I think, to your point, it would just add this extra layer of tension and confusion to the series that would make it bigger, rather than, they could easily make it out where Prince Maekar just says, okay, well, I know where Egg went. He did what, he was going to do, and doesn't end up sending the Knights of the Realm against him, which I certainly hope they don't do. I hope that, I think you could easily write that off without having to change too much. But then again, they certainly could do so.
Well, Jack, it's been fantastic speaking with you. I've really enjoyed this. I know a lot of people have really enjoyed this show, and so I'm glad we could take a little break from what is obviously a rather crazy political world right now and just enjoy a decent piece of entertainment. I also was glad to uncover your long-term plan to become a political influencer so you could ultimately control the fate of your favorite book series. But if people want to catch what you're doing, where should they be heading?
Thank you. Yes, it's been my long-term plan for quite some time, a decade and a half. It has now seen itself to fruition. But yeah, no, we do human events daily. People can go check that out wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, and then at Jack Posobiec, just across all social media.
Fantastic, guys. If it's your first time on this YouTube channel, you, of course, need to subscribe, click the bell notifications so you know when we go live with streams like this one. And if you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to head to your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show. When you do, leave a rating or review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.